the last few years, we've been looking at alternative ways of re-increasing the piezoelectric response in films, and that's being done largely through the use of engineered domain states and oriented thin films. From a device standpoint, the two most recent things that we've been working on first is a thin film version of a biomedical ultrasound system. So medical ultrasound is ubiquitous. It's the most widely used imaging modality because it's less expensive and it doesn't involve ionizing radiation. But most ultrasound systems are big, desk-sized things. What we're trying to do is to replace the bulk piezoelectric material with a thin film. As you do that, that allows you to use much lower drive voltages. So in contrast to bulk materials, we're now CMOS compatible on the drive and receive electronics. So what we're trying to do is to take this massive piece of equipment and ultimately make it something that'll be a few millimeters on the side. And so we're taking the best optimized materials that we have in terms of generating piezoelectric response. We're putting them on larger vibrating structures, and we're trying to generate and receive sound with it. I think I'm pretty confident that we have a receive response, and we're working now on the transmit response as well. There's an enormous push around the world, particularly in Europe and Asia, much less in the US, for replacement of lead in a variety of applications. At the moment, the entire field of piezoelectrics is exempted because you save a whole lot more lives with medical ultrasound than you lose in the manufacture. In general, once the lead is in a ceramic, it's comparatively stable. So it's not likely, it does not have a large leaching rate, for example. People would love to be able to replace it. Unfortunately, lead is really polarizable, and there simply is nothing that's as good at present. As soon as it's developed, there in Europe is already legislation that mandates the change. So there are people all around the world, including my group and some of my collaborators' groups in the U.S., other groups around the U.S., other groups around the world working on this. It's not a solved problem. So for right now, we're using the material that's already in use, which is lead-based. And the idea is, in some materials, for example, a perovskite that's rhombohedral, it will have 8 possible polarization states like this. And if you pull it, those become the ones that are favored. And if the material has an underlying softness, you can fold those polarization vectors up with an electric field and sometimes actually cause a transformation from that state to this one. That's exciting for a variety. It doesn't sound exciting, but that is exciting for a variety of reasons. One of which is if you do this in some materials, you can take the piezoelectric coefficients up by factors of 5. And this is like the best thing that's happened in our field in 50 years. So this is very exciting. It's a complete revolution in the field. It takes the coupling coefficients up above 90%. It means that 90% of the energy you put in as electrical energy comes out as mechanical energy. Or, the square of that comes out as mechanical energy. Or vice versa. That takes a single crystal. It's really painfully difficult to grow single crystals, big single crystals of these multi-component oxides. One of the components is always volatile, and it's just very hard to maintain absolute stoichiometry control along the length of a crystal. And so my approach was to say, well, maybe we can't always make the single crystal. Can we take a bulk material, a polycrystalline ceramic, but orient every single grain so that it looks along this one axis like a single crystal. And our approach, the approach that Gary Messing and I have taken, is to put little template particles of materials, often they're flat, so we can align them when we tape cast them, in a matrix of the material we care about. And then once these are aligned, we heat treat it so that all the material around it regrows as the oriented, basically as a little tiny single crystal. And you can get about 2/3 of the response of a single crystal in the textured polycrystal with an approach that we hope is manufacturable, is scalable. So not everyone can afford to pay, the prices for a single crystal of this size. They're still comparatively expensive. But if you could do a bulk processing technique and get most of the properties and pay a penny or 10 pennies for the part, maybe that would be more interesting. And so what we've been trying to do is to lay out the fundamental science associated with how do you do the orientation. All the materials that are really interesting for piezoelectric applications come from a cubic prototype group. So figuring out how to make that material anisymmetric so that you can make little platey particles that you can align, playing with that has really been important. And then understanding what the role of real orientation distributions are on the ultimate properties has been something that's really been of an interest to me. And the hope is that ultimately you'll be able to replace the conventional piezoelectrics that are used for energy harvesting and for actuators with a next generation that'll be several times better in terms of piezoelectric response. Imagine a chunk of material. It starts as a cube, and when it develops a polarization in the perovskites, the material elongates parallel to the polarization and it contracts laterally. In many of the perovskites, there's more than one possible direction for the polarization. So in some regions, the material is going to pull up. In some regions, it will pull down. And there'll be a boundary, a domain wall between them. So that domain wall is just the boundary between the polarization vectors. When you have a domain wall like this material elongated this way, this material elongated this way. So when you shiver the domain wall, it doesn't give you a lot in terms of piezoelectric response. But if you have a material that's elongated this way, beside a region that's elongated this way, and you can move that boundary back and forth, now you're changing the volume fraction of the material that's elongated this way. In bulk materials, domain wall motion accounts for typically 1/2 to 2/3 of the usable piezoelectric response. That's what matters to you.
That's all that matters.
And so associated with that is also hysteresis. So the family of soft piezoelectrics have very mobile domain walls, so they'll have very large piezoelectric coefficients, but they'll tend to be hysteretic. The hard piezoelectrics, it's hard to move the domain walls, and so they'll have smaller piezoelectric coefficients, but they'll tend to be less hysteretic.